Hi everyone. As you might know, we don't get any sort of funding from any wealthy benefactors, academic institutions, governments, or political parties. Our work is funded by you, our listeners and readers on Patreon. In return, our supporters on Patreon get access to exclusive content and benefits like ad-free episodes, bonus podcast episodes, and 2 exclusive Patreon-only podcast series, Fireside Chats and Radical Reads. So here's a little preview of our latest Patreon-only episode. You can join us, help support our work, and listen to the full episode today at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day. A million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts grey, are brightened by the beauty sun discloses. And the people here are singing bread and roses, bread and roses.
Just to begin, I guess maybe if we just talk a little bit about, why you decided to write this book. What are the debates that you were kind of responding to or inserting yourself into, and how you felt this book would kind of contribute?
I think it's a book that we were kind of thinking through a lot of the ideas that came through in the book. We were thinking together through the kind of work we were organising around. In London, I met Mike around the time of the Occupy movement, and we were part of an editorial collective of the Occupy Times there. And post-Occupy, that editorial collective was very engaged with, being a media outlet for the kind of movements that happened at the time, all the way up to, I would say, a signal point being 2016, 2017. And I suppose at that point, as we all know, a lot of the energy changed towards more kind of electoral projects. And one of those was Corbyn in Britain and Sanders movement. And what we found at that moment then was essentially a very divisive sectarian discourse on the left started to emerge around identity politics, and the way that term was being used was just mainly pejorative. And what it kind of denoted, or what it's supposed to mean, was any politics around race, gender, was kind of disruptive or disrupting a more universal position. There are a lot of people around those movements, electoral movements, were very keen to kind of message on or strategize. So there was kind of an urgency there to be a movement that represented everybody and kind of sought a kind of a socialism that could be ordinary. So, at the same time as that, as we all know, there was fascist far-right activity. There was the alt-right that became a sort of media spectacle within the liberal media. And that through that, I think one book in particular that really made a massive landing on the left. I mean, it's a very highly published book, even though in our view it is a very terrible one, is Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies. And really what do you think, Mike? I mean, at the time we were just looking at this and going, in a way we were like, what the fuck is going on here? Because it became so publicized. And the argument, really schematic, kind of reductive argument really is that post BLM, and if you like, where trans issues became more visible, that had caused a reaction online that had provoked the far right and the alt-right into its activity. And the alt-right was emulating so-called identity politics. And that was really, the base of the argument. And for us at that moment, I think we were like exploring lots of avenues in our own experiences in the collective we were in. And we saw this as a really destructive argument that was even worse for it was very easily marketable. And it was a kind of argument that would then arrive on larger platforms. So what we wanted really is like, well, how do we encounter that kind of problem, that argument? And how do we explore identity as an issue as well, which is mutated for a long period of time historically. So I think when we came to discuss this idea of this book around 2016, 2017, we were very engaged with radical histories, Black histories, feminist movements and the tensions internal to them. And, you know, one of the kind of clear realities of being in the movements we were in, but also historically, is that these movements have always been divided, that this wasn't some kind of novel thing that happened with the internet, that happened with the so-called Tumblr left, which is a term that Nagel used to kind of represent any issue that are organized around race or gender is, you know, somehow kind of internet inspired and simply vacuous. Whereas really waiting in the weeds, if you like, was this authentic class politics that everybody should focus on. And, you know, from the reading we've done and the experiences we've had ourselves within the collective and within movements, we wanted to really explore historically this problem and the problem of division and how movements compose themselves generally. So rather than leave it at the platform of a sort of discursive back and forth, you know, full of all this heat that there was around this debate at the time, we wanted to bring a little bit of light to it and, you know, treat it as a historical problem, identity as a historical problem, one that is being produced by capital and the regime of the state, rather than treat that as some kind of novel kind of discursive element that's been produced from the recent time of the left. So I think that was kind of how it started, Mike, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think what we found in the writing of it was how much this needed to be contextualized in longer histories of colonialism and movements and struggles, and to you know, that in the introduction, the conclusion, we are quite focused around kind of contemporary like discourses about how way that people are talking about identity politics and wokeness and things like that is a kind of an appropriation of kind of Black political language and Black political struggles in order to be dismissive of them. But then I think we wanted to focus our chapters onto these kind of longer histories and these kinds of divisions within movements, divisions within the working class, will constantly cropping up in different ways in different periods, depending on how particular states implement social control practices, in terms of how histories of race operated in those particular countries. So, you know, these ideas about like what is permissible on the left are very contingent. They're very dependent on like the strength of anti-racist struggles or the strength of feminist struggles in certain periods when these discourses would be, you know, much more effectively shut down.
And you see where the priorities are really, that there's a sense in which there's a weird left, or there's, you know, an anti-race or a too militant left, an abolitionist left, that kind of, you know, a transgender critique of cis-normative Marxist thought or thinking that was kind of functioning, operating. Wouldn't all of these things kind of coalesce around these terms? Because in a sense, there's a prejudice that they wouldn't kind of function for the working class. And really what that reveals is there's a sort of nominal working class that's been assumed there, assumed as white. But that these reveal, if you like, historical problems with also of how the left conceives of itself and its relationship to the working class. And, you know, I think that's one aspect of the book we do early on, is to give a history of what an woke left politics is, what an anti-identity politics position is. And it does go far back. And Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels in particular, I've developed a quite schematic view historically, with all sorts of historical problems contained within it, to make this argument that actually neoliberalism produced or invented these kind of problems. And that was I think that sort of periodization does maintain in different ways. And it was something that we wanted to challenge in particular, really, that we shouldn't be, we shouldn't think of neoliberalism in that kind of methodologically nationalist lens as this thing that happens, a form of government that kind of happens and divides national left projects. That it's, you know, it's as global as international struggle is global, and we need to relate to it in different ways. So I think that was, they're also, this is immediately in the book, you know, we say it's about identity politics, and we're going to analyze this term, but there's all these other related terms that spin off. And, you know, what are we looking at here? And we keep it pretty organic, really, to try and develop that problem imminently and just bring people in positions in to move to the point where we start to, you know, look at movements historically, take historical scenes from, you know, post-60s and the 19th century, and see how division has always been this contestable point because of the colonial makeup of societies we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say on that I've recently been reading quite a lot of kind of class reductionist and conservative leftist like articles and pamphlets, and there's one in particular by a communist party that I'm not going to name just because I can't be bothered with the discourse. But, you know, reading their position paper on identity politics, I was just struck that there were just no historical examples, you know, and that was the thing that I think that's what I really liked about this book, is that it's never a kind of abstract idea of, okay, this is what, you know, identity is, or this is what capitalism is, or this is, you know, I don't know, whatever, sexism or racism or anything like that. They're never just kind of these abstract concepts, but each one of them is historically located, and the movements against them or movements in support of them, or, you know, they're always historically located. I think that's a real kind of strength of the book. It's never that abstract thing, but it's always what's actually happening on the ground.
There was also a UK-based anarchist pamphlet that I read not too long ago that was a critique of identity politics, and it also didn't historicize anything really. It was a kind of attempt to kind of say, look, we're not, you know, we care about patriarchy and racism, but this thing that we're calling identity politics that we're not really defining and we can't point to as a really existing thing is a bad move for the left because it doesn't deal with class.
There's a key point now I want to come in on that, because I think, yeah, one, it's an ahistoricizing term, isn't it? That's kind of how it functions. You know, when it's used, and this was part of kind of laying it out in the beginning of the book, when it's used, it really is used as a kind of, well, you know what we mean term. It's used in the sense to organize a kind of sentiment that's assumed. So in that sense, it really is ahistorical, and that's kind of the point of it. But it is attached to a certain historiographical story, which is there was a break, there was a rupture. So there may have been a more authentic feminist politics or anti-racist politics at some point, but the neoliberal break with that meant that all of those movements and those ways of moving in politics are just, you know, kind of vaporized, really, instrumentalized to the point in which they are not just not useful, but they're an attack on the working class. And, you know, those ideas are so prominent, you know, and they deal, you know, I think we might get to this, or maybe we could just jump in it right now, but there is a conspiratorial aspect to that kind of can jump off, which is that, you know, you take the imagery you're kind of encountering all the time, or you take a Hillary Clinton speech, you know, where Hillary Clinton will use gender or being a feminist to attack Bernie Sanders. And, you know, there's real effects of that. And there's an instrumentalization there of feminism to try and make those attacks at a national level. Or the CIA will, will have an advert and it'll be, you know, look, there's DAI here, everyone's inclusive. And these kind of imageries become more content to show and demonstrate that this is neoliberal identity politics. And that's why any politics associated on the ground with those movements, which has absolutely no relation at all to how it's been instrumentalized, gets kind of brought up in that and kind of caricatured in the same sense. And that reflex is so common, and it continues in lots of different ways. And, The reason why we call it the hatred of identity politics as a subtitle really is that a certain kind of resentment is pooled and then instrumentalized, and that can go off in all sorts of different places. And it's not to say, as we say from the very beginning, that identity isn't instrumentalized. Of course it is. But at the very least, what we can do is be specific about how it is. If we want to kind of understand how incorporation works all the way through the labor movement, which is usually never discussed in the same terms, that the labor identity that was constructed as white and racialized as white, that there was opportunities there for incorporation, the tensions, internal conflicts between trade union organizing, between representation and the shop steward movements. All of these conflicts internally, they were never what was meant by identity politics. This was something to do with feminism, anti-racism, and those histories. And, that needs to be looked at. If we've got an issue with how a representation has been instrumentalized in the movement to be a part of and organizing within, then we can encounter that in a sensitively presented way and be specific about what the problem is. And, that often happens and in a situated kind of place. And, you can kind of reason around that. And there's other people who point to how identity is being instrumentalized and are very specific about it. And we need those critiques. What we're trying to push against in this book is this abstraction really, and how it developed a conspiratorial kind of motion in the discourse and allowed certain figures within the left to take quite bold, kind of ambitious critiques that that weren't just operating in the sky. They were entering into movement spaces. People were passing around. Well, there's this person. There's Adolf Reed said this. They're, in a sense, these critiques that were supposed to unify the left were dividing it.
I think that another part of the kind of conspiratorial aspect of it is the way that, when people are talking about identity politics, they're not defining what they mean by it, but what they're doing is they're investing an inordinate amount of power into the people that they're accusing of being, these kind of people who are part of some kind of nefarious identity politics movement or force, that they're these kind of wreckers who are all they wanted, that they're somehow inherently middle class, that they are, usually seen to be young, and that basically what they're doing or what they want to do is to divide and destroy kind of class unity, or if it's other kind of people who are critiquing identity politics, then the collectivity that they see a threat towards is different. It might be the nation, it might be, democracy itself, for kind of a lot of the kind of transphobic, gender critical movements. It's womanhood that's being divided. If you look at a lot of the kind of writing of gender critical, writers and people online, they used the identity politics language a lot as a way of explaining the kind of what they see as a kind of the novelty of trans existence, and it being a kind of a product of this kind of generational confusion. So yeah, it's that there is this sense that the people who are behind identity politics have great power, and that's very recognizable as a kind of conspiratorial frame.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty sure that I'm stealing this term from a tweet of yours, Michael, about sort of anti-identity politics being conspiracy theory adjacent. And so even if it's not, explicitly conspiratorial, there's certainly something in the structure of it that mirrors standard kind of conspiracy thinking. Specifically, kind of, if you think of, anti-identity politics as kind of being like, well, elite academics and cosmopolitans who may or may not be rootless in their existence are using feminism and anti-racism to divide the working class. It's not a million miles away from just, openly, well,
Jews are using feminism and black people to destroy the nation. You know what I mean? Especially when the working classes itself figured, you know, in kind of figured as white or figured as, you know, in a particularly kind of like masculinist kind of forms.
If you replace identity politics or wokeness with cultural Marxism in a lot of the ways that they're used today, then it works the same way.
I kind of would like to talk about black feminism.
Yeah, I really, usually when we've done these things, we spoke about that first, because I think that, you know, it relates incredibly importantly to the frame and introduction where we historicize this anti-identity politics discourse. And one of the things that obviously changes there is that identity politics begins as a radical militant concept to understand fracture and division within black liberation movements. And, you know, it ends up as this kind of signifier of a divisive element. So there's a complete reversal, really, of what the initial conception was there to do. And we start with the US case, really, of women's liberation, and we start with Combahee River Collective, their kind of exposition of identity politics as a collective, and what this is intended to do. And what becomes really apparent when you read that text closely is that it's a critique of identity thinking internal to the movement. So, you know, that black liberation becomes universalized. Actually, it's not, because there's masculine elements and male elements in there that suppress kind of the women's context and black women's situations within that composition. They're looking at the feminist movement and analyzing the whiteness of that movement, you know, the whiteness of the women's movement and the tension within black communities and for black women, whether to associate with feminism at all because of that whiteness. So really, they're looking here and saying, well, we're taking this perspective and you know, what's been historically produced is this identity of black women that essentially doesn't fit into some of these constructs that we're kind of trying to deal with. So it's very historical, and really it's a way of looking at that period in the 70s, where you've got the black liberation movements have come into conflicts, they're fraying, and really analysing what the position is here for liberation. It's very militant. So, you know, what's distinctive about it is it's coming from a grassroots perspective and a militant perspective, and it's there as a critique of tokenism, it's there as a critique of instrumentalization of identity, and to form positions where you can start to think about and kind of revise what's understood as a working class movement. So so we look at US, and really what that chapter is meant to do is to look at what internal debates and conflicts were going in within the American women's movement, and how that's been discussed, and how certain kind of ideas around black liberation developed further on than that. And one of the reasons to do that is that identity politics and intersectionality were just kind of used as almost like coterminous problems in the way these contemporary discourses developed, and to show really that intersectionality and black feminist liberation are have their own different developments as well, and that these histories need to be qualified rather than conflating, because you see someone who's a black woman like Kamala Harris in the US, that's proof really that these histories don't really mean anything more, or they've kind of been evaporated. That actually, if we get local to what the historical moment and situation is, that way of thinking around identity is a critique of identity thinking, of relating identity and non-identity. That identity becomes imposed on people, and then people have to deal with it and have to find kind of political momentum within that kind of moment of domination. That's what's been discussed in that chapter. And parallel to that, we look at British black feminism. So writers like Hazel Carby, who does an incredible kind of pamphlet at the time called White Woman Listen. And again, straight away, incredibly instructive, pushing against an idea of tokenism, or that black women think all the same, or that there's just one identity here, and looking historically at Britain's colonial relationship to race and immigration, and how racialized women have been differentiated in the labour force. So really, what we argue in those first two chapters is that not only are all these writings by black feminists at the time very varied, and there's lots of debate within that, and they provide some of the most cogent critiques internal to black liberation, but also the feminist movement as a whole, but also they provide some of the best Marxist analysis. A lot of the tension for kind of political left Marxists around race is that, Alan Watts's notion that capitalism can survive as a class project, but it doesn't need race. It couldn't survive without class, but it doesn't need race. And what we're trying to demonstrate as part of those two chapters, that black feminist work, really, you can't think around class composition without some of these kind of instructive texts that, that set up, I think, methodologically the whole book for us. That these arguments really then take us immediately into the Aliens Act in the 19th century, and we can start to think about these histories with these tools. So I suppose, in terms of the role black feminism's playing in this book, it's methodological as well as just key historical interest. And I think for people who are just used to receiving this term identity politics and these critiques of intersectionality, really low-hanging fruit most of the time, stuff that kind of should be kind of obvious, for incredibly powerful people who are racialized that also dominate lots of other people, they don't necessarily represent these longer histories of within the black radical traditions. So we use those chapters really just to ground our understanding of what the identity politics concept was doing in its historical location and what it was conceived to do, and really set up an idea of looking at race and borders, race and labour differentiation, the way race is understood by black feminist collectives in Britain and the US as differently developed, because those colonial regimes have their own interests. All these kind of particular ways of analysing the world we're in are, part of this, these kind of intellectual inquiries. So I think that is what we're doing in those two chapters, and getting to the problem of the identity of womanhood and how that's been discursively developed, and how this work really just takes that apart, but just does take it apart in sort of not only kind of destroys these notions of identity thinking around womanhood or around the universalization of liberation, but actually allows us or gives us the kind of tools to sensitize ourselves to different ways of looking at how class works.
As we come marching in the beauty of the day.
That brings us to the end of this episode preview. To listen to the full thing and help support our work researching and promoting people's history, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes.